Hi everybody, welcome to our second session on altruism and economics, and here's what we're going to discuss. From this class session, I want you to be able to explain the value to a nonprofit of understanding the supply and demand for what we're going to call altruistic opportunities, and we'll explain this all in the coming slides. And then we're going to talk about why altruism can produce more economically efficient outcomes than self-interest. We'll talk about how it establishes new Nash equilibria, why altruism lowers transaction costs, and why it satisfies something called Rosenberg's rule. So let's start with the supply and demand stuff. And I'm going to introduce an idea here that I'll call an altruistic opportunity. And I want you to think about this as a thing that a donor buys. So, we don't typically think of donors purchasing things, but if we were to assume that's what's happening, what would they buy exactly? Well, I like this economist's idea of the idea that donors buy altruistic opportunities. They're buying a chance to engage in altruism when they make a donation. And so if you think about that as like the product that they're buying, not a box of cereal, but in this case, a chance to be altruistic, it raises some questions. For example, what does the supply curve look like? Here I've drawn it in a very lazy, sloppy way as upward sloping, meaning as quantity increases to the right, price goes up on the y-axis. And the question is that true? Another way to ask this, if you want to do more good in the world, does each new act of good or marginal act of good become more expensive to do? Let's think about like vaccinating children around the world against a variety of diseases. Well, it makes sense that some kids are cheaper to vaccinate than others. A kid who lives in an urban area or a kid who lives in a peaceful country is going to be easier to vaccinate than a kid who lives in a rural area or who lives in a conflict-ridden country. And so it's true, the more kids you try to vaccinate, the more expensive they become to vaccinate. And if you think about it, pretty much all altruistic activity, like the good that nonprofits try to do throughout the world, it all has this shape or trend to it, that each marginal additional act of good is probably more expensive than the previous one. Some recovering drug addicts are easier to treat and some are more difficult to treat. Some kids are easier to teach and some are harder to teach. Really, you take any kind of typical act of nonprofit activity and you're going to find that the more you do of it, the more expensive it is to do it. So our blue line, our supply curve, probably is upward sloping if we're thinking about altruistic opportunities. Let's look at the demand curve, the very lazily drawn green line that's downward sloping, meaning as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And what this shows, or what this would tell us, is that if the good done for a donation is cheaper, meaning that like I can buy more altruism with my donation, then this would predict that I will buy more of it. And if you think about it, that's probably true too. If I told you could vaccinate a child for $10,000, I wouldn't get very many people donating to that, not nearly as much as if we could vaccinate a child for $1. And so being able to buy more with my donation dollar seems to be an important and real incentive. And so that's why the green curve is downward sloping. Well, this tells us some other things. First of all, the cost of the altruistic opportunities determines the slope of the curve. Some kinds of altruism are very expensive and some are very cheap. Some good done in the world is more bang for your buck. But this also means that there's unmet demand, meaning that there are donors who would give if the good being done with their dollar was more abundant, or alternatively, if they could buy the same amount of good at a cheaper price. And that's an interesting and challenging thought if you think about it. If this is true, then it would tell us that suppliers should focus on the supply curve instead of the demand curve. What they ought to do is try to make a chart that looks like this instead of the previous one, where the supply curve has shifted down and to the right, meaning you have more quantity of altruism provided at a cheaper price. And that's an idea we should explore, because I think a lot of nonprofits today worry too much about about trying to change what donors want rather than giving donors more of what they want. It's pretty common to hear nonprofit managers complaining about how donors want the wrong things. And that's like a grocery store saying that grocery purchasers want the wrong things. You don't try to make them want different things. You sell them what they want. And the way you would do that is you'd pay attention to the factors affecting the slope of the supply curve. You'd look at the price of the altruistic opportunity, or inversely, the value provided at the same price. You'd look at the accessibility of the altruistic opportunity, like how easily can the donor make the donation, or you'd look at the elasticity of your supply, meaning how quickly can you respond to donor interest. This brings up practical instead of moral dilemmas. We spend less time worrying about what donors ought to want as a moral question, and instead we think more practical ways about how do we provide donors with more of what they want. And I'd argue that this is what suppliers of altruistic opportunities should do. If you're running a nonprofit, you shouldn't be out there trying to change what donors want, because really donors fundamentally want the world to be a better place. Of course, they have opinions about how it gets there. But if it's fundamentally true that donors want the world to be better, then you should figure out a way to do more of that at a cheaper price. Not just reducing price, but improving availability and increasing value and increasing elasticity of supply. Why a donor gives should only be important to you if it's a way for you to improve any of the supply curve factors. So what does this look like in practice? Like, what are practical examples of what I was talking about? Well, if you're a nonprofit and you're paying attention to price, you might do more fundraising and have a smaller suggested gift. There's research that shows that a suggested gift can create a burden or barrier for people to donate. If you move your suggested gift too high, some people just won't even donate. And so you can price signal through suggested gifts, and maybe you just need to do more fundraising at a lower average donation. Increasing availability of donations means making it easy for donors to contribute. The American Red Cross pioneered this in response to the Haiti earthquake, where you could donate via text message. It was so ridiculously easy to donate that they raised $1 billion. It was a historic day of fundraising, or period of fundraising. You can increase the value for the dollar. And one of the ways you can do that is not just, you can increase warm glow, right? You can help donors feel like their donations are making a bigger difference. So that'd be like having an awards banquet for your donors. And then finally, you increase the elasticity of your supply. Whatever you're doing, you can quickly do more of it in response to donor demand, like a health-focused nonprofit doing health trainings on demand rather than just a fixed schedule. These are all examples of how nonprofits can be more responsive to donor interests of making the world a better place and doing it at a cheaper price. Some questions we'll discuss in class that relate to this model is, if I'm selling bread, I can find out the market price for bread. How do nonprofits figure out the market price for charitable giving? And then we're going to talk about how giving is really effective, and if so, why and how, and we'll discuss that more. Okay, let's talk now for the rest of this recording about the benefits of altruism over self-interest. There are ways in which altruistically motivated behavior is more economically efficient. One of these reasons relates to the prisoner's dilemma, which you've learned about in econ or you've done in my negotiations class. You remember this is how we played it in my negotiations class if you were there. But the basic idea that we explored either in econ or this is the idea of a Nash equilibrium, which is, and we talked about this in the previous recording, the Nash equilibrium happens when people in a competition can't improve their outcome by changing their strategy. Well, in a lot of game situations, the Nash equilibrium is depressingly bad. Like in the prisoner's dilemma, it's this one, where this is the second lowest individual outcome and by far the lowest social outcome, meaning that the scores combined together is a social outcome. Well, what we will see is that and we're going to discuss how this works in class, but if you inject even a little bit of altruism into the incentives of players in the prisoner's dilemma, it basically creates a new, better, more abundant Nash equilibrium in the game. And so one of the things that altruism does is it keeps us from competing with each other in a way that destroys value. And there are all kinds of benefits that result from that. Another way that altruism is more efficient is that it can reduce transaction costs. Richard Timmis was an economist who wrote a book called The Gift Relationship, and in it he talked about altruism and how beneficial it is. And he made one really interesting argument from research he did about blood donation rates in the UK versus the United States during the 1970s. So back in the 70s, blood donors in the US were paid, and blood donors in the UK were unpaid, meaning that UK donors were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Well, what was interesting is during the same time period, both countries had the same base rate of hepatitis infection, meaning that the same percentage of the population had hepatitis. Well, hepatitis can be an endemic infection, meaning it's hard to get rid of it. If you donated hepatitis-infected blood, the blood donor recipient could get hepatitis. So we have to make sure we screen out any infected blood in our blood collection system. Well, his question was, if we're paying blood donors in the US and we're just asking UK donors to be generous and we're not paying them, do we have a difference in the infection rate of blood? And the answer was yes. Basically, compensated donors in the US were donating infected blood at a rate over 3 times higher than those in the UK. And if you think about it, this makes sense. If you're donating blood to be generous and you have hepatitis and you know it, you'd have to be a sociopath to donate infected blood. So you're just going to opt out. You're not going to show up. Whereas in the US, if you're being paid to donate blood, you might be tempted to donate infected blood. It's not that you want to get somebody sick, but you want to get paid. And what ends up having to happen is all this blood has to be screened out, and then the wasted time was there to collect that blood, and it just has to be disposed of rather than used. And so it just wastes a lot of time and money. And so here it's interesting. Asking people to be generous created a more efficient outcome than paying people for what you're asking them to do. And we're going to discuss some other examples of this idea at work in class together. And then finally, we're going to talk about Rosenberg's rule. And this is I'm calling it this because I first encountered it from an article written by a professional fundraiser in the San Francisco Bay Area. He called it Rosenberg's rule when he was trying to encourage people to tithe to secular things, like pay 10% toward, doing social good in the world. And his observation was that social problems tend to grow faster than the return on capital does, meaning that whatever's happening that's bad in the world gets worse at a quicker rate than the speed at which our investments will grow. So the reason this is important is because if this is true, and if you can make a donation that has the impact today rather than later, it's better to give today. Because if you wait to give, the donation is going to grow faster than your investment. Or sorry, not the donation. The social problem is going to grow faster than the money you were saving to donate later. If I took $1,000 and saved it and got 10% compounding returns over a 20-year period, I'd have $6,727 to donate 20 years later. And that sounds a lot more impressive than donating $1,000. But the social problem, if it grew at 20% a year, which I think is conservative actually, it's going to far outpace at a compounding rate, the return on investment. We'll discuss this example more in class. We'll get into more details. But if it's true that social problems grow faster than investment returns do, and if it's true that your donation today can prevent those problems from growing, then the time value of money just says it's better to give today than later. And we'll explore that and the implications of that in class. And I'll see you then.